Hi, I'm Ashton, and today I wanted to talk about being gay. More specifically, being T4T and what that means and where it came from and the discourse around it. I've seen a little bit of, discourse, controversy happening around it recently, and it's been very interesting to follow. So I'm gonna go through some of that. If you don't follow me on Instagram, which is fine, you don't have to, I'm boring on Instagram, I posted about wanting to make this video a couple days ago as of me filming this, and I got a lot of really interesting feedback and I had some really wonderful conversations. And I don't know, I put it all together and we're gonna talk about it now. Per usual, this video is slightly structured. I'm gonna start with kind of a background, then I'm gonna talk about the discourse, then I'm gonna kind of discuss fetishization in opposition to being T4T, then I'm gonna kind of break down why I think some people see being T4T as a fetishization of transness, then I'm gonna talk about why it is not that, and then I'm going to talk about some other assorted things that I just think are really interesting, but kind of don't belong in any of the predefined categories, right? I do also want to say right off the bat that this video is going to be moderately adult themed. I'm not going to say anything hyper explicit, but there will be some language that may not be comfortable or normal for my younger audience. I know most of my audience is 18 plus anyway, but I'm not gonna designate this video as 18 plus only. I don't think it's inappropriate. This is more of an education community discussion video. I just wanted to give that warning. If you're not comfortable with hearing that sort of language being used, that's fine, you don't have to watch this. Before I jump into this with the assumption that you know what T4T is, T4T stands for trans for trans, or trans loving trans. It originated in Craigslist personals in the early 2000s, where trans people were looking to hook up with or share space with other trans people. The popularization of it is often credited to Tori Peters, and if you want to learn more about that specific part of it, there is a gender reveal podcast episode with Tori Peters from 2021 that's really good. I will link that down below. So T4T as a phrase meaning trans for trans, how it is used online, in person, in tattoos, on Lex a lot of the times, sometimes on Grindr, in a lot of digital queer spaces, as well as in-person queer spaces. And it is kind of a moniker for trans people seeking other trans people who love other trans people, and it's something that I really enjoy, and it is a circle that I oftentimes find myself within. The way that I see T4T used today is often as a calling card for trans people who love other trans people, kind of as a if you know thing. You rarely see people saying trans for trans. You frequently see T4T because if someone who doesn't know what it means sees it, they'll probably just scroll past, but if you know, you know. And that's kind of intentional, I feel like. And while it obviously originally was meant for interpersonal, two-person or more, I don't know, relationships, it is very much now something that does indicate that, but also kind of indicates a larger cultural phenomenon of trans people supporting other trans people, of trans people building community with other trans people, prioritizing other trans people, creating, spaces that are meant for trans people. It's very much a politic or an ethos of centering trans people in your life and recognizing that your transness is oftentimes best appreciated and understood by others who share that label and share that experience. I don't think T4T is restricted to relationships anymore as it may have once been. It's very much a cultural phenomenon, subcultural phenomenon perhaps, that kind of arises in not only relationships but content, art, literature, friend groups even. And I wanted to pause on that for a moment, I guess, because it is something that I appreciate in the sense that I feel like when I was growing up on the internet, a lot of content made by trans people was made for cis people. And that's content not just in terms of YouTube content or social media content, but art. Any sort of media that someone could put online, which is pretty much every form of media, even if it was made by a trans person, it was kind of targeted or marketed towards a cis person. And that's also the case with a lot of trans books that were published before 2010, I would say. T4T as an ethos in content, again, not just social media content, but all forms of art, kind of subverts that and points us towards a world where trans people can create things for other trans people, which feels a lot less isolating than feeling as a trans person you're automatically pigeonholed into making educational content for cis people. or like art that is like an intro to transness, or a book that's like defining gender. T4T allows you to expand beyond that because the people that you are writing for or creating for already understand what gender is, and you don't have to give a 101. A large part of my appreciation for T4T dynamics is not just in my own intimate experiences, even though that is also the case. It's also an appreciation for trans art and things that are created by trans people for trans people rather than by trans people for cis people. I know that a lot of my audience is trans, and that's not to say that cis people are like not allowed here, but it means that I can make things for people like me rather than making things explaining myself, you know? And for me, that's really valuable and necessary, and I think that is probably not something that only I experience. Before I get on to the discourse, I am going to recommend a few like T4T media sources, perhaps. One I already mentioned is the Gender Reveal podcast. I love Tuck. They're an icon. We've been Twitter mutuals for like 5 years. Tuck is a delight and a great interviewer, and the podcast as a whole has so many incredible guests and like so many really good conversations. But I searched T4T on YouTube to see what was out there, and a video that was like T4T book recs came up. I read most of the books on that list already, but there's a couple that I had not read and I'm looking forward to now. So I will also link that down below. Little representation, little sampling of what I mean when I say trans media created by trans people for trans people in a T4T way, rather than like educational media, you know? So the discourse, let's talk about it. There's a couple branches of T4T discourse that I've seen go around, but they kind of center on the same thing. I'm not gonna like put up any posts on the screen because I don't want to call people out, and I'll talk a bit more about why in a later section. One of the main stems of discourse is that people who are T4T are chasers, which is a very, in my opinion, bizarre interpretation of what a chaser is and why chasers are a bad thing. And then the other kind of branch of discourse along the same lines is that being T4T is fetishization in some way, which again, in my opinion, kind of misses the point of what fetishization is and why it's a negative thing, but I will get into that. But the reason the two kind of branches of discourse overlap so much is because if you have been in trans spaces, you probably know this. The reason that a lot of people dislike chasers are because they fetishize trans people. So saying that T4T folks are chasers and saying that T4T folks fetishize transness are two very similar arguments or critiques. But let's start with the chaser bit. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, a chaser is someone who goes after a specific sort of person for a sexual or romantic encounter, but they do so focused on a singular aspect of who their desired person is. In this case, it is people who look for trans people. Frequently, the term used for that is the T-slur chaser. There are also chubby chasers, people who go after fat folks. There are people who go after disabled folks. There are people who go after people of color. Like, this is a wide-ranging problem, and it's not something that only happens in trans communities, but in a lot of different marginalized communities. But not everyone uses the language of chaser to describe that phenomenon. Regardless, it is a very similar phenomenon of like a marginalized identity being fetishized and objectified, and someone who holds power, in this case a cis person, going after that specific type of person. It's often seen as predatory, objectifying, and those are the reasons that it generally is bad. So one of the frequent like discourses I see surrounding T4T desire is that people that are T4T or are looking for T4T relationships are chasers, or that it is chaser behavior. And again, I think it kind of comes from a misunderstanding of what being a chaser is and what being T4T is, but there certainly are chasers in the world, and I'm not saying that there aren't trans people that behave in the way that chasers do, but very frequently it comes from a different motivation, and I don't think that the effects are the same. Chasers are real, they're out there. Experiences with chasers range from like uncomfortable at best to like assault and harassment at worst, and it's not a problem that we should like ignore or sweep under the rug necessarily, but it is a separate issue than T4T love. Like, those are just not really comparable. I feel like it's also important to like note that not every cis person in a relationship with a trans person, or not every cis person that sleeps with trans people occasionally, is a chaser. Like, chasers necessarily look for trans people specifically because they are trans and they objectify that part of that person. A lot of people will compare it to how some white men especially will love the idea of having an exotic partner, or the historical and current exploitation and hypersexualization of Black people specifically. So the point is, right, the reason I'm arguing against this discourse is that there's a major difference in terms of institutional power when it comes to experiences of marginalization between chasers and trans people. So like if we have chasers on one hand and we have folks that are T4T on the other, chasers are people who in general seek trans people to fulfill a sexual desire that is impersonal, based on transness wholly and as an isolated characteristic that they find hot for fetishistic, objectifying reasons. And transness fulfills a sort of one-dimensional desire. T4T people, on the other hand, are people who seek out an experience that reflects in one way or another their own. T4T desire can be sexual, but it is not typically objectifying, and it is very rarely impersonal, and it does not necessarily come from a place of mismatched institutional power. There are, of course, T4T relationships where one person's white and one person isn't, or one person is disabled and the other isn't, but the trans-cis dynamic is not there, and that's the dynamic that I am focusing on. So like, yeah, chasers exist. Chasers suck to deal with. I've been there. Most of us have been there. But T4T people are not chasers. If folks that are T4T are behaving in ways that are harassing or objectifying, then they're still not necessarily chasers, because that institutional power dynamic that kind of creates that space for that harassment to happen doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that trans people can't be chasers for other reasons. There are certainly trans people that are chubby chasers. There are certainly trans people that want an exotic partner, but again, a lot of the times that comes from some sort of institutional power difference. I also kind of wanted to have a bigger discussion about fetishization, because I got a lot of really interesting responses that tried to break this down when I posted about it on Instagram, and I don't know, I think it's a fascinating discussion. So there are certainly times in which being fetishized is an issue. I was really tempted to go down like the Marx commodity fetishization rabbit hole for this part of the video, but I didn't, so you're welcome. But I had a couple people respond when I talked about, is being T4T fetishization of trans people, are fetishes always bad? Like, why is a fetish something that we have to define as a bad thing? So I want to make this like very exceptionally clear, the way that I'm discussing this. I wholeheartedly believe that fetishes and kinks are super cool, super fine, a very standard part of the human experience and should not be stigmatized. I wholeheartedly believe that sexuality in most of its forms is value neutral. I want to make it very clear that what we are specifically discussing when we talk about fetishization is the behavior of dehumanizing and objectifying people or groups that fit your desires in a inherently exploitative way. Hello, as I'm editing, I've had further conversation about this specific topic, re the use of the word fetish and the way that people sometimes discuss T4T relationships versus chasers. And I had a conversation with my friend Finn, who is also trans and in the kink scene, who had some further thoughts about the complexities of the way that we discuss this, and I wanted to share some of those clips here.
The way that queer people have sexual gratification and just expressing yourself and expressing your own sexuality is very, very different culturally and socially and sexually compared to cishet people. You could say that me being T4T, yeah, I fetishize trans people, but not in the way that cishet chasers will fetishize trans people. It's for their own sexual gratification. There's no regard for the trans person's emotions. There's no regard for their own pleasure. There's no regard for their own fetishes. There's no communication balance. There's just no balance. You know, I come from a place that is not vanilla and not traditional, even for like a trans person. Most of my like sexual gratification and appreciation for queer culture comes from kink, comes from fetish. Society has built such a negative connotation around the word fetish. It's hard for me to say that without feeling that ick, you know, of how people have perceived fetishes in such like a gross and kind of non-acceptable way. It's just people treat fetish as just not acceptable in the public eye. Being T4T is more so of that gratification, fetish, and appreciation of each other's emotional state, physical state, transition state, regardless of what you get out of it. Because you can be T4T and be asexual. You can be T4T and not have sex. You can be T4T and be platonic. You can have a queer platonic relationship with someone and still be T4T. It is a fetish without that selfish sex gratification that chasers are trying to achieve by exploiting trans people for their own sexual gratification.
The conclusion that I kind of came to based on this discussion as well is that vanilla people a lot of the times use the word fetish as an immediate bad thing, like with a bad connotation, when the fetish with chasers is not the problem. The impersonal and non-consensual way that they go about chasing is the problem. Finn's card will be in the description if you want to check out any of his work. He's very funny on Twitter and he makes a lot of cool art, so I would recommend following him. Back to the rest of the normal video. It might be easier to break this down if I use an example that is not something that is actually traditionally, like, systemically and institutionally marginalized or oppressed. So if we think about someone with freckles, for example, it wouldn't be wrong, right, to think people with freckles are sexy. In a similar way, it would not be wrong to think trans people are hot, because it's true. But it is wrong, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, to, like, specifically seek out people with freckles purely because they have freckles, disregard all other interpersonal nuances of whatever situation there is, because all you care about is the freckles, and you treat your partners as people with freckles, like that's the important part of their personhood to you, to satisfy your desire for freckles rather than the individual people that they are. So that's kind of the distinction here. Like, there's nothing wrong with having an interest in trans people. There's nothing wrong with thinking trans people are hot. There is something wrong with acting on that interest in a way that is exploitative. There is something wrong about using your privilege and power as a cis person to put trans people down in a way that is objectifying. And when people fetishize trans people, it's oftentimes, not always, but frequently, because of our genitals. Frequently, chasers will use language like boy pussy and girl dick as, like, overarching things when not all trans people are comfortable with those terms for their own genitals. They'll talk about wanting to get a trans man pregnant, wanting to be topped by a trans woman, and those are things that they discuss their desire for regardless of the person. If you follow, like, any trans sex workers or are friends with any trans sex worker, you will know that those people inevitably get comments and DMs that are really disrespectful of their boundaries that they have, like, specifically set, because if you're trans, you're going to attract people like that. And that doesn't mean it's okay, but it is, like, a reality. When things like wanting to get a trans man pregnant or wanting to be topped by a trans woman are discussed with no care for the person attached to the genitals, that's fetishizing. But when those things are discussed in t4t spaces, they are most of the time discussed alongside a host of far more complex feelings of appreciation and love and care for transness as a whole, and transness as something that is, like, a beautiful and natural part of human gender variance. Those types of conversations are very, very different than a cis person obsessing over girl dick and never even thinking about, let alone celebrating, the infinite other ways that transness shapes someone's personhood. I also had a lot of responses to my story along the lines of the way that chasers objectify and fetishize trans people being a problem. Chasers and people that fetishize trans people are not only an issue because they do what they do, but also because of where that drive comes from, and frequently it's because transness is taboo and our bodies are non-normative, and a lot of the times that's very explicit in the way that they discuss their desires, and that's also kind of where a problem lies, right? Because if someone likes you, but they only like you because nobody else likes you, or in their perception, nobody else likes you, that doesn't feel very good. I don't know, that's not a hot take, right? It doesn't feel very good when someone's like, well, I like you because everyone else hates you. So that's a beginning to, at least, the fetishization discussion, but I also wanted to kind of break down why I think people think being t4t is fetishizing. So the original reason that I wanted to make this video was because of a post I saw on Twitter, and this is something that I see relatively frequently. The original post was by a trans girl who was making a joke about wanting to get another trans girl pregnant, and it was a funny tweet. It was a good joke, but another trans person quote tweeted it with, like, you all are chasers, like, if you call yourself t4t, you're just exploiting the trans community or whatever. I feel like I kind of get where that comes from sometimes, even though I disagree with it. And I have three, like, theories as to why some people view t4t-ness in this way. The first one, I think, is likely the most prevalent and most obvious, is that very frequently the people that I see arguing against t4t circles or relationships are younger queer people that are very online and lack any sort of real-life queer community. And I'm not saying that that's their fault, because depending on where you live, especially, being queer can be really isolating, and it's never someone's fault that they don't have access to community in the same way that someone living in, like, I don't know, Portland or San Francisco does. However, it does mean that sometimes those people, especially when they're younger, have a lot less perspective on what queer communities are like. And again, that's not necessarily their fault, but it also doesn't really excuse attacking trans people's love for each other on the internet for no reason. Kind of similarly, I feel like it can also stem from being uncomfortable with yourself and your own transness. And again, that can definitely be influenced by isolation and lack of community, as well as a lack of comfort with trans joy. One of my friends responded to my story with like, why do people hate trans joy? Which is so true, especially because a lot of the people that I see discoursing about whether T4T is fetishizing or not are trans people. I don't know, I don't see the point in policing trans people's desire for other trans people. Why are you mad about trans people loving each other and finding fulfillment in loving each other and celebrating that? I don't know. I just don't think it's something that deserves to be critiqued when there are so many bigger issues, right? And maybe I'm kind of playing into it by making a video about it, but I think it's a really interesting thing to explore, okay? The third thing that I think kind of influences why people think being T4T is fetishizing is purity culture. I think that has a much bigger influence on a lot of dynamics on the internet than we expect it to. I'm not going to do a deep dive on what purity culture is and how it influences us. There's already plenty of people that have done that on the internet, but I certainly think it plays a part in anti-T4T discourse. It kind of parallels, in my opinion, some of the arguments against autogynephilia, like the Blanchard thing, which again, I'm not going to delve into. But the idea of autogynephilia essentially is that some trans women are trans women because they find sexual pleasure in seeing themselves as women, which is a really bizarre and backwards way of looking at it, because when a cis woman finds sexual pleasure in seeing herself as a woman, that's totally fine. But when a trans woman does it, then it's fetishizing, then it's a problem. People hate sex, and people hate when people have sexual feelings. It's policed a lot of the times. It's considered a disorder. It's pathologized. And I think people expressing T4T intimacy and desire and love for T4T intimacy online oftentimes get like pushback from people who are very indoctrinated by purity culture, saying like, hey, don't talk about this shit, right? People think it's gross to have desires when that type of desire is totally normal and totally cool and valid and fun. And there's nothing wrong with being trans and loving another trans person. And policing that desire and wanting to make that desire disappear and like go underground is a very cop-like move. It's very like Blanchard-esque to me. So those are my three like theories as to why people think being T4T is fetishizing. And at least when people who think it is fetishizing are trans people, I kind of just feel bad for them. Like, it's hard for me to get angry at people who are oftentimes young, people who are oftentimes trying to find queer community online because they don't have access to it in real life. A lot of the times I just think those people have a lot to learn and a lot to experience. I think the people that police T4T desires are the people who would probably benefit from T4T community, I feel like maybe that goes without saying, but that's my insight. So my second to last section is going to be kind of a deeper maybe exploration on why being T4T is not fetishizing behavior and is not problematic in the way that some people may argue that it is. Kind of in accordance with my three previous points, I feel like the belief that being T4T is fetishizing can sometimes be a misunderstanding of the motive behind being T4T. Because if the motive behind being T4T was, I find transness hot and I don't give a shit about anything else behind the trans person, then yeah, maybe it would be a problem. But that's not the case for a lot of people. The general things that I took away from my Instagram story conversations, as well as my own experiences with being T4T and a bunch of my friends' experiences with being T4T, is that being T4T is about these things. Safety, not wanting to feel judged by your partner, wanting a safe trans space away from the uneducation or miseducation of cisgender people. When you're seeking relationships, when you're seeking sex, when you're seeking communities, you don't want all the time to be in the same room as cis people that you have to explain what a pronoun is to. That stuff is exhausting, and all of us do it pretty frequently, and we don't want to do it when we're trying to fuck. Another commonly mentioned reason was just wanting to avoid the inherent power dynamic that comes with a trans-cis relationship. A lot of people enjoy T4T relationships and circles because other trans people can appreciate transness as an intricate aspect of one's selfhood that cannot be understood by a cis person, as well as the idea of prioritizing connections with people that understand such an intimate part of your identity can be really healing for people. Another thing that a lot of people mentioned was wanting to avoid fetishization from cis people. A lot of other people also mentioned that it can be really healing to feel loved with your transness included and understood in that love. It can allow access to queer sexuality. And then I also have a few more unique things that I pulled out as quotes that I really liked. One person said being T4T is about rejecting the idea that being desirable to cis people is a transition goal, which I loved and really related to. And then another person said being T4T is about our shared experience as an unspoken bond. We bend gender and know the feeling of not fitting in society's definition of beauty. Our relationships with our bodies are different than those of cis people. I see more than just wrong parts in a trans body. I see a journey of love in navigating a relationship with the self. I thought that was worded really beautifully and kind of emphasizes the way that being T4T is not about liking trans people, it's about feeling this connection that you cannot get with a cis partner, which is pretty cool. And then another comparison that kind of goes back to fetishization, but also discusses why people may be T4T. Fetishizing trans people often reduces them to their genitals, whereas T4T dynamics tend towards the opposite, acknowledging the broad spectrum of trans bodies and identities. Even the language, right? T4T, it's not like AMAB for AMAB or AFAB for AFAB, which, you know, kind of reflects why people get frustrated when people like on Lex or on Twitter are like, I'm T4T, but AFAB's only, because that's not what being T4T is about. It's about sharing the experience of transness. It is not about someone's assigned gender at birth. Another, like, in real life friend of mine replied that, I don't think I truly loved my own trans femininity until I loved another trans femme, which I also thought was really beautiful and really speaks to the power of seeing yourself and your experiences reflected and like truly genuinely understood by another person, as well as the power of sharing language with someone who appreciates labels and language in a way that you maybe don't, or in a way that you do, and being able to share that. Another thing that a lot of folks pointed out that I also thought was very true is that it isn't fetishizing to be attracted to features that you may also have, especially if the shared factor between these features that you are attracted to is that society undervalues them or they are not part of a beauty standard. Broadly, in my experience, like T4T circles recognize, celebrate, and enjoy gender incongruent features, which cis people either don't enjoy or ignore or fetishize. Some things that I see really frequently are like the appreciation of top surgery scars, blatant enjoyment of T-dicks and bottom growth and girl dicks, women with facial hair, men with high-pitched voices, women with low-pitched voices, people that are balding, men with wide hips, women with wide shoulders. All of those things are things that are generally seen as like unattractive, but in trans spaces, we're like, fuck yeah. Being in trans spaces that appreciate those things allows you to both appreciate those non-normative aspects of your own gender and gender expression, as well as find common ground with people in a way that cis people can't. Not that cis people can't have gender incongruent features, obviously, but nobody appreciates gender incongruent features like someone else who also has them, and that is definitely a part of why so many trans people end up dating other trans people. There's also, I think, an appreciation of non-normative gender expression that cis people don't all the way get all the time, right? Including, but not limited to, body modification, combinations of makeup and facial hair, alternative fashion, flat chests or not flat chests on bodies that may not typically have those traits, skirts on men, suits on women. General gender nonconformity is appreciated by other trans people and other gender nonconforming people in a way that it isn't always appreciated by cis people. Again, not to say that all trans people appreciate those things, but if you're in a T4T relationship, if you're in T4T circles, those things are a lot more likely to be celebrated than they are if you're in a big room of cis people. T4T desire allows for appreciation for secondary sex characteristics that, for cis-normative reasons, are not typically seen as valuable or desirable or hot on people who they wouldn't typically be associated with. But when you're T4T, all of those things are not only normal, but like sexy and cool, and it makes you feel better about yourself. And why would it be fetishizing to appreciate things about yourself that you share with your partner when those are things that are disliked by society for oppressive reasons, you know? The last thing I wanted to talk about is some more complex ideas about some of the problems with T4T circles or like the idealization of being T4T. And I had a conversation with my pal, my mutual, my comrade, Mateo. I'm gonna link his card in the description so that you can find like all of his links in one place. He wrote a literal 200-page paper on transsexuality, and it is so interesting, and I've read a little bit of it so far, but I'm so excited to delve into it, and I feel like a lot of you will enjoy it also, so I am going to highly recommend that you check that out. It's the second link in his card. Anyway, I kind of wanted to talk about some of these things because I do think that there can and are genuine issues in T4T circles and in T4T relationships, but those issues are not typically that T4T folks fetishize trans people. It certainly can be the case. None of this discussion is to say that that doesn't happen, but I do think it's important that that does not come from the same place, and being T4T does not inherently mean there is fetishization happening, whereas chasers do inherently mean there's fetishization happening. In talking about some of the conversations that he had with participants in his research, Mateo talked about how some people find it more difficult to be T4T because the number of trans people who refuse to not work on their internalized isms and other issues seem to be easily found in dating apps and in trans communities, which is totally true and is definitely an issue with T4T relationships. Just because someone is T4T doesn't mean they're going to be free of other biases, and it's a little, I don't know, naive to pretend that all T4T relationships are perfect when there are certainly other things that impact T4T-ness. He notes that there are a lot of trans people who want to be T4T, but the trans people in their community are fatphobic, racist, or transphobic, which really sucks. And it does, for sure. One of my responses to him where I said, there certainly are issues in trans communities and in relationships between two trans people, but they aren't necessarily because of T4T dynamics themselves. It seems to me that it's just because trans people, especially and most notably more privileged trans people, are still people inevitably influenced by the bigotry that surrounds all of us. T4T relationships can be liberatory, but transness isn't the only thing you have to accept and love for a relationship to be liberating. And fatphobia, racism, ableism, etc. can all still have massive impacts on T4T circles and relationships, even when those circles and relationships align themselves as T4T. In response to that, Mateo talked a bit more about some of his research. He'd spoken to some folks who were in toxic T4T relationships because the other person fetishized their trans partner or refused to unlearn certain ideas about their trans partner. However, it isn't because the partner is trans that they're being an ass, they just simply are an ass. And I think it's important to tell people that being T4T can be more liberating, but that doesn't mean you are safe, which really sucks. Telling people from your own community that they will not be in community with everyone, but it's important for others, especially recently out trans and queer people, to realize that just because you may share an identity with someone doesn't make them safe, which I think is really fucking important. I guess the complete 180 of what happens with T4T discourse are people who are like, you should only be in T4T relationships, and every T4T relationship is better than every cis and trans relationship, which simply isn't true. Like, the world is so much more complicated than that, and not every trans person is as liberated as they may think they are, and there are certainly trans people who have other things to work through. It's really easy to moralize T4T relationships as something that are inherently liberatory or inherently good all the time, when at the end of the day, every relationship is different. And yeah, T4T relationships are, in general, probably healthier than cis for trans relationships, but that doesn't mean that there aren't really bad T4T relationships. There are definitely trans people that fall into the exact same pitfalls that a lot of cis people do. Think about trans medicalists, trans people that really don't like non-binary people, white trans people with really colonial views about gender. All of those things can impact literally pretty much any trans person, and you can't assume that a partner is going to be safe just because they are trans like you are. Anyway, that was my video. I hope that at least started an interesting conversation, or continued one that I had already started having in many ways. But yeah, as someone in a T4T relationship and as someone who has had more than one T4T intimate partner, I think it's a really fascinating way to kind of delve into the complexities of trans circles, because you're not going to talk about this with a random cis person. I adore the idea of T4T as an ethos, and I really enjoy delving into these kind of complex and messy gender topics. So I don't know, I would love to hear more thoughts, experiences, nuances that you all think of. This sort of video always has so wonderful, thoughtful comments. I hope that all of your relationships, whether they are platonic, romantic, queer platonic, sexual, partners benefits, I don't care. I hope that they are all wonderful, whether or not they are T4T. But I hope that if you are T4T, you find freedom and joy in it, and that you understand the ways in which it benefits you, but you also don't glorify it as a perfect relationship model that works for everyone all the time in every circumstance, because that's also not the case. Life is complicated, unfortunately, and sometimes you just have to sit with that. Goodbye. I hope that your relationship, or lack thereof, is healthy and wonderful for you right now as you are, and I will talk to you later, maybe.